On a frigid morning in November 1944, just outside the French town of Bergaltruf, a German anti-tank gunner named Schmidt crouched behind his weapon, watching through the gun sight as American Sherman tanks rolled toward his position through the lingering mist. The ground was frozen solid, and Schmidt had been fighting these particular American tankers for 3 straight days now. Something about this engagement troubled him deeply. Something that contradicted everything his instructors back in the Reich had drilled into his head about racial hierarchies and the supposed inferiority of certain peoples. The lead tank approaching his position was clearly damaged, trailing dark smoke from somewhere in its engine compartment, but it kept advancing despite having absorbed multiple direct hits. Through his optics, Schmidt could make out the tank commander clearly. A black soldier standing exposed in the turret, firing the .50 caliber machine gun mounted there with complete disregard for his own safety. This was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, though Schmidt would not learn the man's name until many decades later, when military historians finally pieced together the details of this particular encounter. Despite carrying a wound so severe that his leg had been slashed down to the bone, Rivers had turned down morphine, refused evacuation, commandeered another tank after his first one was disabled, and pushed forward with his company toward Gabeling the following day. For 3 consecutive days, this man had continued fighting with a gangrenous wound that should have rendered any normal soldier completely incapacitated. What Schmidt witnessed in those final moments before Rivers' tank was finally destroyed would stay with him for the remainder of his life, but not because of the violence itself or the brutality of combat. No, what haunted Schmidt was how completely this encounter shattered everything he had been taught about racial superiority. These supposedly inferior soldiers were displaying levels of courage that exceeded anything he had witnessed in 5 years of continuous warfare across multiple fronts. The entry of the 761st Tank Battalion into the Second World War represented far more than just another American unit joining the massive Allied effort. It was the collision point of 2 fundamentally opposed worldviews, where Nazi racial ideology would meet its complete and undeniable refutation on the actual battlefield. The battalion's motto declared they would come out fighting, and from their very first engagement at the small Belgian town of Morville-le-Vicq in November 1944, continuing through heavy sustained combat all the way to the war's end, that is precisely what they did. Their fight carried a double meaning that German forces would soon come to understand in the most direct and visceral way possible. Among the German forces preparing defensive positions to face them were units whose personnel had been indoctrinated since childhood in theories of racial superiority. Wehrmacht training materials explicitly stated that black soldiers were categorically incapable of operating complex machinery, fundamentally lacked courage under fire, and would inevitably flee at the first serious sign of combat. These were not merely casual prejudices or offhand assumptions, but rather fundamental beliefs that actively shaped German military doctrine and battlefield expectations. The 761st would spend 183 consecutive days in combat, proving every single one of these assumptions catastrophically and completely wrong. The battalion was formally constituted on March 15, 1942, and officially activated on April 1st of that same year at Camp Claiborne down in Louisiana. The activation did not come from any progressive military thinking or enlightened leadership philosophy, but rather from what internal War Department documents candidly described as political necessity to maintain Negro morale. The path this battalion would take to reach actual combat was fundamentally unlike that of any white unit in the entire United States Army. The men who comprised the 761st trained for nearly 2 full years, constantly aware that white units were being shipped overseas after considerably less training time. While white armoured battalions typically deployed after just 12 to 16 weeks of training, the 761 would train for over 2 years, mastering absolutely every aspect of armoured warfare, because they understood completely that any mistake, any failure, would be attributed not to them as individuals, but to their entire race. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates, the white officer who commanded the battalion, was considered career dead for even accepting the position. But Bates had served in the First World War and had personally witnessed French colonial troops fighting with tremendous distinction. More importantly, he judged men solely by their ability and competence, not by the colour of their skin. His assessment after those 2 years of intensive training was unequivocal. The 761st was the best-trained tank battalion in the entire United States Army. Among the men who would ultimately prove him absolutely right was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers from Hotulka, Oklahoma, standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, who had grown up working on a farm and possessed what Bates described as an intuitive understanding of terrain and tactical situations. There was Warren G. H. Creasy, who would eventually earn the nickname Iron Man for his extraordinary combat endurance and seemingly inexhaustible stamina. And there was the battalion's most famous member, a man who would never actually see combat with the unit. First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt, Robinson of the 761, an exceptional athlete who would later become one of the greatest baseball players of all time, lost his chance to deploy with his battalion when he refused to move to the back of a segregated military bus during an incident at Fort Hood, Texas, in July 1944. After completing their 2-year training session in Texas, the 761 Tank Battalion received orders on June 9, 1944, for overseas movement, just 3 days after the Allied landings at Normandy. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean aboard the British troop ship Esperance Bay, arriving in England on September 8, 1944. Following a brief period of deployment in England for final preparations, the 761st landed in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. They were immediately attached to General George Patton's Third Army, one of the most aggressive and fast-moving formations in the entire European theatre. Patton's initial skepticism regarding black tankers was extensively documented in personal correspondence and official records. He had written to his wife expressing doubts about their ability to think quickly enough for the demands of armoured warfare. Yet on October 28, 1944, Patton delivered his now famous speech to the assembled battalion. He told them directly that they were the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army, that he would never have requested them if they were not good soldiers, because he had nothing but the absolute best in his army. He stated plainly that he did not care what colour they were, as long as they went up there and killed those Kraut sons of bitches. He reminded them that everyone had their eyes on them and was expecting great things from their performance. On November 7, 1944, the Black Panthers finally received their opportunity as they attacked the German-held town of Morville-le-Vicq in support of the 26th Infantry Division. The German defenders, comprising a mixture of Wehrmacht infantry and specialized anti-tank units, fully expected an easy victory against what they had been repeatedly told were America's inferior troops. The battle lasted approximately 4 hours of intense urban combat. Right inside the town itself, the lead tank was immediately hit and knocked out by a German soldier wielding a Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. 2 crew members from that tank were wounded in the attack. Their comrades immediately dragged them to safety behind the disabled tank and then proceeded to hunt down and kill the soldier who had fired the Panzerfaust. German after-action reports, discovered decades later in military archives, noted with considerable surprise the exceptional tactical proficiency demonstrated by the attacking tank unit. They had fully expected panic and disarray when the first tank was struck. Instead, the 761st executed a perfectly coordinated assault that systematically eliminated German defensive positions one after another. Another tank commander, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, encountered a German roadblock that forced his tank to halt under heavy enemy small arms fire. Without hesitation, he leaped out of his tank, attached a tow cable from his Sherman to the roadblock obstacle, remounted his vehicle, and then had his tank physically pull the entire obstacle off the road, thereby freeing the tank column to resume their advance and ultimately capture the town. Rivers would receive the Silver Star for this particular action, the first of numerous decorations that members of the battalion would earn throughout their service. The month of November 1944 saw the 761st engaged in virtually constant combat operations. The unit would ultimately endure 183 days of continuous operational employment without relief or rotation to rear areas. The 761st Tank Battalion suffered 156 casualties during November 1944 alone. 24 men killed in action, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The unit also lost 14 tanks that had to be evacuated and another 20 damaged in combat operations. These dry statistical figures do not adequately capture what German forces were gradually learning through direct experience. The black tankers they had been confidently told would flee at first contact were instead maintaining an operational tempo that actually exceeded most white American units operating in the same theatre. While typical tank battalions were routinely rotated to rear areas for rest and refit after 10 to 14 days of sustained combat, the 761 remained in the front lines continuously without any such relief. German intelligence reports from this particular period, now housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, begin displaying considerable confusion regarding the identity of these exceptionally effective tankers. One report from the 11th Panzer Division specifically notes that an enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displayed exceptional maintenance of vehicles and aggressive tactical employment inconsistent with previous intelligence assessments about American Negro units. The most dramatic demonstration of the 761st's absolute determination came during the assault on the town of Gebling. On November 16, 1944, while advancing toward Gebling, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank struck a mine at a railroad crossing. Although severely wounded with his leg slashed completely to the bone, Rivers declined an injection of morphine, adamantly refused to be evacuated to the rear, took command of another tank, and advanced with his company into Gebling the very next day. Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, repeatedly issued direct orders for him to evacuate for medical treatment. Rivers' documented response was characteristic. "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days will not make any difference." A medic who inspected Rivers' grotesquely swollen and obviously infected leg looked up at Williams and shouted that the sergeant had developed gangrene. Williams only had time to say the name Reuben before German guns suddenly zeroed in on their position, forcing all the Americans to take immediate cover. On November 19, 1944, the end finally came for Staff Sergeant Rivers. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Bergeltroff, their next objective, but were abruptly stopped by concentrated enemy fire. Captain David Williams, the company commander, ordered his tanks to withdraw and take cover in defensible positions. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he had successfully spotted the German anti-tank gun positions and transmitted simply, "I see them, I see them, we will fight them." Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on the enemy tank positions, providing covering fire for Company A as they executed their withdrawal. While doing so, Rivers' tank took a direct hit that killed him instantly and wounded the rest of his crew. Captain Williams immediately submitted a recommendation for Rivers to receive the Medal of Honor, though it would require 52 years before that recommendation would finally be properly acted upon by the military bureaucracy. December 16, 1944, brought the Wehrmacht's final major offensive operation, codenamed Watch on the Rhine by the Germans, but known to American forces as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was hastily attached to the 87th Infantry Division and immediately thrown into the desperate fighting to halt the German breakthrough attempting to reach the port of Antwerp. The battalion faced some of Germany's absolute best remaining combat units, including elements of the Führer Begleit Brigade, an elite formation that had been expanded from the Führer's personal escort battalion. The fighting around the Belgian town of Tillit was particularly brutal and unforgiving. Replacements were extremely hard to come by at this stage of the war, and many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were either raw and completely untrained, or alternatively, were rejects from other units who were totally unfit for combat duty. Despite receiving woefully inadequate replacements, the 761st continued fighting without respite. The combat was absolutely brutal, and the 761st Tank Battalion Shermans, along with the 87th Division Infantry, had to struggle against bitter, determined resistance with every single step forward. The German forces included the fearsome Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could destroy Sherman tanks at ranges where the American 75mm guns could not even penetrate the Tiger's frontal armor. Yet the 761st developed innovative tactics to compensate for this technical disadvantage. They utilized their superior mobility and mechanical reliability to flank the heavier German tanks, and they maintained more vehicles in actual fighting condition through superior maintenance procedures. One of the battalion's tankers, Sergeant Frank Cochrane, shouted over the radio during one particularly intense engagement that they had hit him 3 times, but he was still giving them hell. By January 9, 1945, the town of Tillet was finally in American hands. The 761st had helped stop the German offensive cold, but the cost had been extraordinarily heavy in terms of casualties and destroyed equipment. February and March of 1945 saw the 761st participating in the major assault against the Siegfried Line, Germany's final major fortification system protecting the homeland. The battalion was attached to the 103rd Infantry Division specifically for this assault operation. Within just a few days of intense combat, the supposedly impregnable Siegfried Line was broken, and enemy troops began coming forward to surrender in increasingly large numbers as German resistance collapsed. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted approximately 4,000 casualties on German forces, and captured nearly as many prisoners of war. The nature of combat here was fundamentally different from operations in France and Belgium. Now they were fighting on actual German soil, facing increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht regular forces and Volkssturm militia units desperately defending their homeland from invasion. Yet German soldiers were simultaneously beginning to surrender in larger numbers, particularly when they realized they were facing the black tankers they had heard rumors about through the military grapevine. Prisoners were absolutely terrified to be captured by black soldiers, believing thanks entirely to their own propaganda that they could expect no mercy whatsoever from such supposed savages. The African Americans of the 761st quickly learned not to rise up out of their tank hatches until surrendering German troops came quite close, lest the Germans see their black skin, howl in sheer terror, and run away rather than surrender. This fear, based entirely on Nazi propaganda depicting black soldiers as savage and merciless, proved completely and utterly unfounded in actual practice. The 761st treated all prisoners strictly according to Geneva Convention protocols, frequently sharing their own limited rations with captured Germans who were hungry. As the 761st crossed into Germany proper during March 1945, they encountered scenes that revealed the true horrific nature of the regime they were fighting against. German civilians, thoroughly conditioned by years of intensive racial propaganda, were absolutely terrified of the approaching black soldiers. Many fled their homes rather than remain in areas about to be occupied by the 761st. Yet the battalion maintained strict military discipline throughout. There were no reprisals against civilians, no widespread looting, no revenge attacks of any kind, despite the racial hatred they knew perfectly well these people had been taught to harbour against them. This professional conduct thoroughly confused German civilians who had expected these racial inferiors to behave exactly like the savages depicted in years of Nazi propaganda. The tank battles continued relentlessly as the 761 pushed deeper into the German heartland. They faced Panther medium tanks, Tiger heavy tanks, and the increasingly desperate resistance of SS units who knew exactly what awaited them if they were captured. Warren G. H. Creasy, who had thoroughly earned his Iron Man nickname through countless actions, was particularly notable during this period of operations. He would frequently dismount from his tank at night, armed only with an M1 Garand rifle, to conduct personal reconnaissance missions into enemy-held territory, gathering intelligence that would prove invaluable for the next day's operations. One of the most profoundly meaningful moments in the entire 761st combat history occurred on May 4th and 5th, 1945. An even grimmer encounter had taken place on May 2nd, when the advancing tankers liberated the Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, discovering approximately 15,000 Hungarian Jews who were near death from starvation and disease. The scene that greeted these black tankers defied any coherent description. Thousands upon thousands of skeletal figures, many so weak they could not even stand, filled the campgrounds. The SS guards had fled several days earlier, callously leaving the prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled in oral histories that here were people who looked like walking skeletons, desperately trying to smile, trying to wave at their liberators. Some of them were crying with relief and joy. The American tankers gave them everything they had with them, all their rations, their chocolate bars, absolutely everything they could spare. The symbolism of this moment was not lost on anyone present. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were now liberating the victims of Nazi racial hatred and genocide. One young woman liberated by the unit, 17-year-old Sonja Schreiber-Weitz, later described the soldier who saved her life in a poem she titled The Black Messiah. She wrote that a black American soldier stood by the door, and she had never seen a black person before in her entire life. She thought he must be the Messiah coming to set her free before she died. By the end of April 1945, the 761st would become one of the very first United States battalions to link up with advancing Soviet forces. The historic meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945, with various sources giving dates ranging from April 26th to May 5th or 6th. Tanker Leonard Smith received the shock of his entire life when a stout Russian woman tank commander approached him shouting "America, America, America" repeatedly while enveloping him in a tight bear hug until he could scarcely breathe. The Soviet forces, including numerous female tank crews serving in combat roles, showed absolutely no surprise whatsoever at encountering black American tankers. For them, what truly mattered was that these were fellow soldiers who had survived the absolutely brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion's official combat record speaks eloquently for itself. 183 consecutive days of sustained combat operations from November 7, 1944, through May 6, 1945. 6 different countries traversed during their advance: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. 4 major military campaigns participated in: Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe. Casualties inflicted on enemy forces totaled approximately 4,000 German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, according to National World War II Museum records. German equipment destroyed included hundreds of vehicles of various types, 31 concrete pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, and 29 anti-tank guns, either destroyed or captured. Unit casualties approached nearly 50% of their original strength. Initial battalion strength comprised 36 officers, 30 of them black and 6 white, along with 676 enlisted men. Total tanks lost numbered 71 complete write-offs. Military awards earned included 1 Medal of Honor posthumously awarded to Reuben Rivers in 1997, 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, and approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts depending on various sources. While specific Wehrmacht documents mentioning the 761st by their exact unit designation remain quite limited, German reactions to encountering black American troops in combat are extensively documented in military archives and prisoner interrogation reports. One surrendering German officer asked his captors directly how many Negro Panzer divisions the Americans had fielded. When informed there was only 1 battalion of black tankers, he flatly refused to believe it could be true. The continuous presence and combat effectiveness of the 761st over 183 consecutive days had created the distinct impression among German forces of a much larger formation. German prisoners repeatedly expressed genuine surprise at the combat effectiveness they had witnessed from black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now permanently housed in the United States National Archives, clearly show German soldiers actively struggling to reconcile what they had personally witnessed and experienced on the battlefield with what they had been systematically taught about racial superiority and inferiority. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told his interrogators quite plainly that they had been explicitly told the Negroes would run away at the very first shot fired. Instead, he said, they kept advancing even when German guns knocked out their tanks. This was not at all what we expected to encounter, he admitted. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945, but the 761st's larger fight was far from over. Like their white comrades in arms, African-American tankers struggled with traumatic memories and what would now be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Unlike white soldiers, however, black soldiers simultaneously had to deal with continuing segregation and the often savage racial prejudice that remained characteristic of this particular period in American history. Texas Native Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr. described the stark contradictions facing black soldiers returning to the United States in an oral history interview, stating bluntly that they did not have equal rights and democracy was fundamentally against them. The men who had destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they still could not eat in many restaurants, had to sit in designated sections at the back of buses, and faced violent racism in many communities. German prisoners of war who were being held in camps within the United States were frequently treated better than the black soldiers who had actually captured them on the battlefield. For 33 long years, the 761st Tank Battalion's extraordinary achievements went completely unrecognized at the official unit level. Individual medals were certainly awarded to deserving soldiers, but the Presidential Unit citation that white battalions received almost immediately after their service was systematically denied to the 761st. It was not until January 24, 1978, that President Jimmy Carter finally awarded the Presidential Unit citation to the battalion. The official citation read in part that the 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary heroism, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous military operations. The ultimate recognition finally came in 1997, when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously, finally received the Medal of Honor they had earned decades earlier. Not until over 50 years after the fact, on January 12, 1997, was the Medal of Honor finally properly bestowed upon Platoon Sergeant Reuben Rivers. President Clinton noted during the ceremony that no African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for service in World War II had actually received it during the war itself, and today they were finally correcting that historic injustice. One of the most interesting personal transformations throughout this story involved General Patton himself. Despite his well-documented initial skepticism about black soldiers and their capabilities, Patton's assessment of the 761 changed dramatically and fundamentally through their sustained combat service. During the chaotic Battle of the Bulge, when German soldiers who had raided American supply warehouses were reported to have disguised themselves as American military police guarding checkpoints in order to ambush American soldiers, Patton solved this security problem by ordering black soldiers, specifically including members of the 761 Est, to guard these critical checkpoints, and he gave them explicit orders to shoot any white soldiers at the checkpoints who acted even remotely suspiciously. This order demonstrated truly remarkable trust on Patton's part. He was literally placing the security of his entire army in the hands of black soldiers he had once seriously doubted could think fast enough for the demands of armoured warfare. By the end of the war in Europe, Patton had personally recommended the 761 Saint for numerous official commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and deeply problematic throughout his life, his purely military assessment of the battalion was absolutely unequivocal. They were among his very best combat units. Ironically, the systemic racism that kept the 761st training for 2 full years instead of the standard few months actually became their greatest tactical advantage. The men of the 761st trained for almost 2 years, constantly conscious of the fact that white units were being shipped overseas after considerably less training. This unusually extensive training meant that when the 761st finally entered actual combat, they were quite possibly the best prepared tank battalion in the entire United States Army. They could perform complete maintenance procedures in total darkness, had completely memorized every single aspect of their tank's mechanical operation, and had developed a level of unit cohesion that only comes from extended time training and living together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified that the delay in sending them to combat, which was absolutely wrong and fundamentally racist in motivation, had accidentally created the best-trained tank battalion in the entire army. They could accomplish things with Sherman tanks that should not have been mechanically possible, he stated. While Reuben Rivers ultimately received the most public recognition, Warren G. H. Creasy's personal story certainly deserves special attention and acknowledgement. Known universally as Iron Man, Creasy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and personally destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment and personnel. During one particularly intense engagement, Creasy's tank was knocked out by concentrated German fire. Instead of withdrawing to safety, he immediately took control of a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a nearby half-track and used it to provide covering fire for his crew's escape while simultaneously destroying the German position that had disabled his tank. He would frequently volunteer for the most dangerous assignments imaginable, personally leading reconnaissance missions on foot behind enemy lines deep into German-held territory. Creasy survived the war, but like so many combat veterans, struggled with what would now be immediately recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences to anyone, and it was not until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation Ceremony that his truly extraordinary service finally received any proper public recognition. One particular aspect of the 761st service that genuinely surprised German forces was their exceptional mechanical proficiency with their vehicles. Nazi propaganda had consistently insisted that black soldiers simply could not operate complex machinery effectively. Instead, the 761st maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in Patton's entire Third Army. This was partly due to their unusually extended training period, but also directly attributable to the dedication of men like Technician 5th Grade William Harvey, who could accurately diagnose specific engine problems simply by listening to the sound alone. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through the night, frequently under active enemy fire, to keep their tanks running and combat-ready. German intelligence reports expressed genuine bewilderment at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they thought they had permanently disabled back in action just days later. The 761st's demonstrated ability to maintain their vehicles under the most difficult combat conditions actually exceeded that of many veteran Wehrmacht units with far more battlefield experience. When facing superior German tanks like the massive Tigers and the well-armoured Panthers, the 761 developed highly innovative tactical approaches. The Sherman's standard 75mm gun often simply could not penetrate the thick frontal armour of German heavy tanks at normal combat ranges, so the 761st perfected flanking manoeuvres they informally called cat hunting among themselves. One Sherman would deliberately act as bait, drawing fire and thereby revealing the exact German position. 2 additional Shermans would then race at maximum speed to flanking positions, specifically targeting the much thinner side and rear armour that the German tanks possessed. This tactical approach required absolutely extraordinary coordination and tremendous personal courage from all crews involved. The bait tank was very frequently destroyed in these engagements. These innovative tactics were carefully studied and subsequently adopted by other American armoured units throughout the European theatre. The 761st's combat innovations contributed measurably to the overall improvement of American armoured doctrine during the final months of the war. During the desperate Battle of the Bulge, the 761 played an absolutely crucial role in relieving the encircled 101 Airborne Division at Bastogne. While Patton's dramatic relief of Bastogne is widely known and frequently celebrated, the specific role played by the 761 is too often completely overlooked in popular histories. Fighting through absolutely terrible winter conditions, with temperatures frequently dropping to -20 degrees Fahrenheit, the battalion helped punch through German encirclement lines. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht forces, but also elite SS units making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement of the surrounded American paratroopers. The 101st Airborne, completely surrounded and running dangerously low on absolutely everything, including ammunition, food, and medical supplies, watched with immense relief as the 761st's Shermans finally broke through the German lines surrounding them. One paratrooper later recalled in an oral history that they genuinely did not care what colour those tankers were. They were the most beautiful sight any of them had ever witnessed. The 761st consistently produced exceptional combat leaders throughout their service. Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long, and Lieutenant Charles Barber all demonstrated tactical brilliance repeatedly under the most intense fire. These black officers commanded their men not through formal military hierarchy alone, but through hard-earned respect and repeatedly demonstrated competence under fire. Captain David Williams, who commanded Company A throughout most of the battalion's combat service, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other company commander in the entire battalion. Most of these recommendations were systematically downgraded or simply ignored due to institutional racial prejudice, only being properly recognized many decades later when historians finally reviewed the original combat reports. The 761st's sustained success came partly from their exceptional cooperation and coordination with supported infantry units. Despite facing initial prejudice from many white infantry units who had absorbed the same racist assumptions as German forces, the tankers' actual combat performance very quickly earned genuine respect. During the assault on the French town of Klimbach, white infantrymen specifically requested the 761st's direct support, having personally witnessed their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide extremely close support, often at great personal risk to the tank crews, saved countless infantry lives throughout their combat service. One infantry sergeant wrote home to his family that the coloured tank boys had saved their bacon more times than he could possibly count. They would drive right into concentrated German fire to provide covering fire for us, he wrote. I genuinely do not care what anyone says back home. These men are absolute heroes. The 761st's characteristically aggressive combat style was directly reflected in their extraordinary ammunition consumption rates. They fired over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an absolutely extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This was not wasteful or inaccurate shooting, but rather sustained, highly accurate fire that reflected their extensive training and tactical proficiency. German after-action reports frequently noted the exceptional accuracy of American tank fire in specific sectors where the 761 was known to be operating. As casualties mounted throughout the sustained campaign, the 761st faced a unique and difficult problem that white units did not encounter. The rigidly segregated army maintained only limited numbers of properly trained black tank crew replacements. Many of the new men eventually assigned to join the Black Panthers were either completely raw and untrained, or alternatively were men being transferred from other units as rejects who were totally unfit for combat duty. This critical shortage meant that experienced crew members simply could not be rotated out to rear areas for desperately needed rest. Exhausted men continued fighting day after day because there was literally no one adequately trained to replace them. This contributed to both the extraordinary heroism displayed and the ultimately very high casualty rate the battalion suffered. The documented presence of the 761st created significant problems for German propaganda efforts. Soldiers who had directly faced them in combat could not possibly reconcile their actual battlefield experience with official Nazi racial theory and doctrine. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 specifically note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who had personally faced Black American units in combat. Soldiers were asking increasingly pointed questions. If the racial theory is actually true, why are we losing battles to these supposedly inferior races? This fundamental cognitive dissonance contributed measurably to the general collapse of fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final desperate months. Before their overseas deployment, the 761 Saint had trained in the American South under Jim Crow conditions that were in many ways as racist as anything they would face from German forces. Most of the black tankers had to train at installations located in southern states such as Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. In the days long before the civil rights advances finally made in the United States during the 1960s, black people were still treated extremely harshly throughout the South and were frequently considered fundamentally inferior by white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas specifically, they faced constant and unrelenting racial harassment from multiple sources. Local businesses flatly refused to serve them regardless of their military service. Military buses were rigidly segregated by race. The battalion was deliberately housed in the absolute worst part of the entire base, located near the sewage treatment plant. Yet this sustained adversity forged truly extraordinary unity within the battalion. The men of the 761st understood completely that they were fighting two simultaneous wars, one against the Germans and another against systemic racism in their own country. This dual purpose gave them a level of determination that German forces simply could not understand or overcome through conventional military means. The most famous member of the 761st was First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson, who would become far better known as Jackie. During the battalion's extended training period, a white bus driver ordered Robinson to move to the back of the bus in accordance with segregation laws. Robinson flatly refused and was promptly arrested by military police. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates absolutely refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arresting military policeman. The post commander subsequently transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was indeed court-martialed, but was ultimately acquitted on all charges. However, the lengthy legal proceedings meant he missed the 761st's deployment to Europe entirely. He received an honourable discharge in November 1944 and would go on to break baseball's entrenched colour barrier in 1947, becoming an American icon. On November 10, 2005, a permanent monument to the 761st Tank Battalion was finally unveiled at Fort Hood, now renamed Fort Cavazos, Texas. The impressive monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a 761st Tank Battalion fighter kneeling atop a black granite pedestal, with a tank engraved on the front face and a panther on the back. The dedication ceremony was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and numerous military officials. The keynote speaker noted that the 761st had fought not merely for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the fundamental principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction and honor. Perhaps the most meaningful validation of their service came from an entirely unexpected source decades after the war ended. In the 1990s, American military historians conducting interviews with former Wehrmacht veterans specifically about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of certain exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these particularly effective units, German veterans frequently described the black tankers who had fought with particular ferocity and exceptional skill. These were men who had absolutely no reason to praise their former enemies, yet they consistently identified the 761st as being among the very best tank units they had faced throughout the entire war. One former German tank commander stated quite simply that they fought like absolute devils, We simply could not understand why men their own country treated as inferior would fight so hard for it. Now I think perhaps that was precisely why. They had something fundamental to prove, and they proved it beyond any doubt. The human cost of the 761st service was absolutely severe by any measure. With nearly 50% casualties, the battalion paid an extraordinarily heavy price for their military achievements. Families back home received official telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands and fathers had died fighting for a country that still did not grant them full citizenship rights. Yet the survivors rarely expressed any bitterness about this fundamental contradiction. Leonard Smith, who became a New York City transit officer after the war, said in a 1995 interview that they knew what they were fighting for was something bigger than the prejudice they personally faced. They were fighting for what America could become, not what it currently was. For many decades, the 761st's story remained largely unknown outside the black community. History textbooks, when they mentioned black soldiers at all, typically focused exclusively on support units and non-combat roles. The combat achievements of units like the 761 Saint were systematically minimized or ignored entirely in mainstream historical accounts. This began changing gradually in the 1970s, with the civil rights movement's increasing emphasis on recovering and celebrating black history. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought significant national attention. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony brought even more widespread recognition. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is properly recognized as one of the most effective armored units in the entire European theater. Their story is now taught at the United States Army Armor School, carefully studied at West Point Military Academy, and honored in museums throughout the country. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion remains profoundly relevant today for multiple reasons. It demonstrates conclusively that prejudice and discrimination represent tremendous waste of human potential. The Army's initial reluctance to utilize black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its absolute best tank battalions. It also shows that true excellence simply cannot be suppressed by prejudice or institutional racism. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from their enemies, the men of the 761 St. Tank Battalion achieved extraordinary things through skill, courage, and determination. Their story challenges all of us to examine our own prejudices and preconceptions carefully. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be so catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions do we make today that might prove equally false? The 761st's exceptional combat record became a powerful argument for military integration in the post-war period. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the armed forces, the combat achievements of units like the 761 Saint were specifically cited as compelling evidence that segregation actually weakened overall military effectiveness. During the Korean War that followed, integrated units performed exceptionally well in combat, validating what the 761 had proven years earlier, that competence and courage recognize absolutely no racial boundaries whatsoever. Many veterans of the 761st served as advisors during this integration process, sharing valuable lessons learned from their unique experiences. Individual veterans of the 761st faced highly varied post-war experiences. Some, like E.G. McConnell, successfully used the GI Bill to obtain college educations that would have been completely impossible before their military service. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their combat service and decorations. Many struggled with what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, then called combat fatigue, for years after returning home. Like many combat veterans, they rarely spoke about their experiences to anyone. It was not until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation that many families finally learned the full extent of their relatives' heroism and sacrifices. The full story of the 761st has been painstakingly pieced together from numerous different sources over many decades, Official army records, German military archives, personal letters and diaries, and oral histories collected many decades later each contributed essential details to the complete picture of extraordinary service under impossible circumstances. The official United States Army history, published in the 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st at all. It required independent historians and the veterans themselves to ensure their story was properly preserved for future generations. Today, the National Archives maintains extensive records of the battalion's service, all available to researchers and the general public. The 761st's liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is now commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors and their descendants have maintained ongoing connections with battalion veterans and their families over many decades. In 2015, the Austrian government specifically invited surviving members of the 761st to ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end in Europe. They were honoured not just as liberators, but as men who had shown genuine humanity in the midst of utterly inhumane circumstances. The German Tigers and Panthers facing the 761st never expected the Black Panthers to fight at all, much less to fight for 183 consecutive days without any relief whatsoever. Nazi racial ideology had assured German soldiers that black soldiers were categorically incapable of operating tanks, fundamentally lacking in courage, and would inevitably flee at first contact with enemy forces. Instead, they encountered men who had trained longer, fought harder, and endured more than almost any other American unit in the entire theatre. The 761st did not just help defeat Nazi Germany militarily, they demolished its racial ideology through undeniable combat excellence demonstrated repeatedly on the battlefield. From the time they entered combat until the end of the war in Europe, the men of the 761 received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor, though many of these decorations were awarded decades late due to institutional racial prejudice. These official decorations only hint at the full extent of their collective heroism. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days without relief, not because they were not utterly exhausted, they certainly were, not because they did not suffer terrible casualties, they lost nearly half their original strength. They fought because they carried the hopes and dignity of millions of black Americans who were constantly told they were not good enough to serve their country in combat roles. Every Sherman tank they drove into battle carried far more than ammunition and fuel. It carried the tremendous weight of representation, the heavy burden of proof, and the absolute determination to demonstrate that courage and competence know absolutely no colour. Every German position they destroyed struck a powerful blow not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the racial prejudices of 2 nations simultaneously, their enemies and their own. The German forces that faced them learned a lesson that fundamentally challenged everything they had been taught since childhood. The black soldiers they had been told were subhuman proved to be extraordinary human beings. The supposedly inferior troops demonstrated superior courage under fire. The men who should not have been able to operate complex machinery mastered tank warfare at the absolute highest level. In the end, the 761st Tank Battalion's greatest victory was not capturing towns or destroying enemy tanks, though they did both exceptionally well. It was proving beyond any reasonable doubt, in the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that excellence is not determined by race, but by training, determination, and character. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting. And for 183 days without relief, against enemies who never expected them to fight at all, they never stopped fighting. Their legacy lives on today, not just in military history, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and recognition that their tremendous sacrifice helped advance. The German Tigers expected easy prey when they first encountered these black tankers. They found instead the Black Panthers and learned that absolutely everything they believed about race and war was completely wrong.